Trump pushing forward with attacks he says are on drug boats headed for the U.S. A new drone strike in the Caribbean. 2 people on the boat surviving, then picked up by the U.S. Navy. And what we now know about the boat tonight that they were on. Here's Martha Raddatz on that.
What would you do if the sky above your country suddenly filled with hundreds of fighter jets, all flying low and ready for action? And what if these weren't just any planes, but the A-10 Warthogs, the ones built to take out tanks and strike fear in every enemy? Could a single formation of aircraft really shake an entire nation? This is the story of 200 A-10s flying over the Caribbean, putting Venezuela on high alert and sending a clear warning to the world. How did the U.S. coordinate such a massive operation without announcing it? What was going through the minds of the pilots as they flew in tight formations over foreign waters? And how did leaders in Caracas, Moscow, and other capitals react when the roar of the Warthogs filled the sky? In the next few minutes, we'll break down how this mission unfolded, the chaos it caused, and the powerful message it sent about air dominance, strategy, and control in the skies. The sky turns deadly. Venezuela woke to a scene no one could have imagined. The morning sun reflected off the Caribbean, and yet the sky was anything but peaceful. A deep roar rolled over the turquoise waters. Out of nowhere, 200 A-10 Thunderbolt IIs, Warthogs, as they're famously called, appeared in tight formation. Low, heavy, and unmistakable, their engines growled like a predator announcing its presence. To anyone watching, it wasn't just noise. It was a warning. These weren't subtle or stealthy planes. They were flying tanks, built for destruction. For Caracas, seeing them was like watching a nightmare unfold. To understand why panic gripped the nation, you need to know what the A-10 really represents. Nicknamed the Tank Killer, the Warthog is a symbol of American ground attack power. At its core is the GAU-8 Avenger, a 30mm cannon capable of tearing through tanks, trucks, and fortified positions in seconds. Since the Gulf War, this aircraft has earned a reputation that even the bravest enemies fear. Slow, loud, unstoppable. These machines are designed to dominate the battlefield. And when 200 of them fly together, the message is unmistakable. This is not a drill. The operation began quietly, far from the public eye. Across Florida and Puerto Rico, air bases came alive in the dead of night. Maintenance crews worked tirelessly, loading fuel and live ammunition. Satellite imagery later showed something extraordinary. The A-10s lined up in rows, engines humming, ready to lift off in perfect coordination. And then, just before dawn, they took off in waves, heading south toward the Caribbean. It was the largest A-10 deployment seen in decades. By the time radar stations along Venezuela's northern coast picked up the formation, it was too late to mistake it for anything routine. Hundreds of aircraft moved in tight combat groups, each armed and ready. For civilians, it looked like the beginning of an invasion. For the Venezuelan military, it was a nightmare prelude to war. And there was no warning, no press briefing, no official announcement. Just engines, sky, and fear. Chaos erupted in Caracas. Air raid alerts screamed across coastal regions. Defense officials scrambled, trying to make sense of what they were seeing. President Nicolas Maduro called his military council immediately, hours of tense meetings following. Venezuelan Su-30 jets were sent up to shadow the A-10s, but no pilot dared engage. Everyone knew these Warthogs weren't alone. Hidden behind them were KC-135 refueling tankers and AWACS surveillance planes, coordinating the operation with precision. From Washington's perspective, this was a statement, not an attack. America wanted to show that it could project overwhelming air power anywhere in the world, at any time. To Caracas, it was terrifying. To Russia, it sent a clear message. Your influence in the region could be challenged. To neighboring allies like Colombia, it was reassurance. The skies still belonged to the United States. This was about psychological dominance, showing the world who controls the air above the Caribbean without firing a single shot. The effects were immediate. Caribbean nations reported sonic booms as the planes passed overhead. Colombian media praised the operation as a deterrent, while Cuba and Nicaragua condemned it as imperialist intimidation. Moscow accused the U.S. of military escalation disguised as drills. Iran warned that America was preparing for hybrid warfare. Analysts tracked increased Russian activity near Venezuelan bases. The tension wasn't just regional, it was global. Every action, every maneuver had eyes watching. Inside each cockpit was a pilot who knew the stakes. Veterans of Iraq, Syria, and Afghanistan, these men and women had trained for precise destruction. Flying low over the Caribbean, they carried the weight of world attention. One mistake could ignite conflict, one miscalculation, and the nightmare could turn into reality. Venezuela's options were limited. To act could invite disaster. To do nothing risked appearing weak. They chose caution, activating defenses but holding fire, mobilizing troops without engagement. They understood the hard truth. A direct confrontation with the A-10s would be catastrophic. For hours, the Warthogs flew in smaller wings, conducting mock attack runs over international waters. Their cannon fire, though aimed at nothing, echoed like thunder across the Caribbean. By evening, the planes began returning north, leaving a silence that was heavier than the roar had been. Washington analysts assessed the mission. The A-10s had demonstrated capability, control, and deterrence without crossing into Venezuelan airspace. But questions lingered. Would Caracas retaliate? Would Russia respond more aggressively? The Caribbean had, for the first time in years, become a potential flashpoint. Drawing lines in the sky, the operation had more than immediate effects. Venezuela's radar operators were tense, every blip a potential threat. Command centers from Caracas to Washington were on edge. For the Pentagon, this was just the first move in a larger strategy, testing how far America could project power without triggering open conflict. The result was clear. Venezuela had been rattled, Russia had been reminded of U.S. reach, and the world had seen the A-10's devastating presence. Military planners quietly mapped out next steps. Carrier groups could reinforce aerial dominance. F-35 stealth fighters and B-1 bombers could join for joint strike drills. Forward detachments in Colombia and Puerto Rico could bring firepower within minutes of Venezuelan airspace. Cyber operations could probe radar and defense networks, invisible yet potentially devastating. Each move was a calculated push, designed to bring Caracas closer to the edge without a shot being fired. Maduro's government faced a public spectacle and a private reality. Operation Sovereign Sky was announced, with fighter jets scrambled and anti-aircraft systems on alert. Troops marched, missiles were displayed, and state television broadcast dramatic footage. But behind the scenes, the truth was stark. Venezuela's military was exposed, underfunded, outdated, and unprepared. In Moscow, footage of the 200 A-10s sparked fury. Analysts called it a rehearsal for invasion. 2 Russian blackjack bombers were dispatched to Venezuela as a symbolic countermeasure. Washington tracked them closely, but didn't respond aggressively. The message was clear. This wasn't just about Venezuela. It was about global posturing and deterrence. Iran also used the situation to influence events, training Venezuelan forces in electronic warfare and sending small drones to coastal bases. The U.S., publicly silent, privately monitored and coordinated intelligence briefings. The phrase axis of influence returned to memos. Russia, Iran, and Venezuela, a pattern the U.S. believed it had broken decades ago. Reactions across Latin America were mixed. Colombia quietly celebrated, seeing assurance of U.S. support. Brazil stayed silent. Cuba and Nicaragua condemned the operation. Caribbean nations requested clarification after sonic booms rattled their towns. Yet, the reality was undeniable. The balance of power in the region had shifted overnight. Defense analysts were stunned. The scale of the A-10 deployment was unprecedented. Some called it a brilliant display of strength without engaging in war. Others warned of its volatility. One misstep could spark chaos. One RAND analyst put it simply, "The A-10s are a message in steel. Don't test us." The question now wasn't if tension would escalate, but how far it might go. Air Force generals called for more flyovers, while the State Department urged caution to avoid desperation from Caracas. The compromise was a plan called Controlled Thunder, maintaining continuous aerial presence and readiness without violating Venezuelan airspace. It was a chess move, saying everything without firing a shot. And as the world watched, the consequences of the operation continued to unfold. Venezuela's military credibility had been shaken. Russian influence was challenged. Allies saw that the U.S. still had reach, and the skies above the Caribbean had once again been marked by a lesson in air dominance. The A-10s had done more than fly. They had sent a message, loud and clear, that silence in the face of American power was no longer an option. Strategic chess across the Caribbean. The impact of the A-10 operation was felt far beyond Venezuela's borders. Every radar operator along the northern coast stayed alert, their eyes glued to screens. Every small blip could be another wave of planes returning, another warning from the sky. For the Pentagon, this was not the end. It was only the beginning, a test to see how far the United States could show its power, control the air, and influence events, all without firing a single shot. The operation had already achieved something huge. Venezuela was shaken. Russia had been reminded of the U.S. reach. Allies and even neutral countries were now aware that America could act decisively in the Caribbean. In Washington, military planners quietly looked at what could come next. Carrier groups could move closer to reinforce air dominance. F-35 stealth jets and B-1 bombers could join for precision drills. Small U.S. detachments in Colombia and Puerto Rico could put planes and weapons just minutes away from Venezuelan airspace. Cyber teams could quietly test Venezuela's radar and defense systems, invisible but effective. Every move was planned to increase pressure without starting a real war. Inside Venezuela, President Maduro and his top commanders faced a very hard choice. They had to act strong to show the people they were in control, but had to avoid making a mistake that could lead to disaster. Operation Sovereign Sky was announced publicly. Fighter jets were scrambled. Anti-aircraft missiles were placed on high alert. State television broadcast dramatic footage of troops marching, missiles rolling, and commanders saluting. It looked confident, but insiders knew the truth. Venezuela's military was outdated, underfunded, and not ready to face hundreds of A-10. In Moscow, the sight of 200 Warthogs flying low over the Caribbean caused anger. Russian analysts called it a rehearsal for invasion. To support Venezuela, the Kremlin sent 2 Blackjack strategic bombers. They flew to Venezuela as a show of strength, but they were mostly symbolic. Washington tracked them closely, but didn't respond aggressively. The message was clear. This was not just about Venezuela. It was about showing the world who controlled the skies. Iran also reacted strongly. State media said the flights showed American arrogance. Soon, Iranian military advisors arrived in Venezuela to help train forces in electronic warfare. Small drones started arriving at coastal bases, adding more surveillance and attack capabilities. The U.S. stayed quiet publicly, but internally, intelligence teams worked hard to track every move. The term axis of influence came up again in internal reports. Russia, Iran, and Venezuela, a network the U.S. thought it had broken decades ago. Across Latin America, reactions were different. Colombia quietly approved of the U.S. show of strength, seeing it as proof that Washington still had their back. Brazil stayed silent, trying not to anger anyone. Cuba and Nicaragua condemned the operation, calling it imperialist intimidation. Trinidad and Barbados demanded explanations after sonic booms rattled towns. But behind the politics, the truth was obvious. The balance of power in the Caribbean had shifted overnight. Defense experts were stunned. The number of planes, the coordination, and the scale of the operation were incredible. Never before had so many warplanes been shown in the Western Hemisphere in such a clear warning. Some called it brilliant, a show of strength without starting a war. Others warned it was risky, a powder keg that could explode if anyone made a mistake. One analyst put it simply, the A-10s were a message in steel, written across the sky. Don't test us. The question now wasn't if tensions would rise, but how far they could go. Air Force generals argued for keeping the planes visible, flying regularly to maintain pressure. The State Department cautioned against pushing Caracas too far, warning that desperation could lead to dangerous moves. The compromise became known as controlled thunder. This meant keeping planes in rotation, ready to respond at any moment without crossing Venezuelan airspace. It was like a warning sign in the sky, clear, strong, and without a single shot fired. The psychological effect on Venezuela was huge. Military leaders knew they were outmatched. Every radar blip and every shadow in the sky reminded them of what could happen in a real fight. Fear spread, even among the most confident officials. They understood that a direct confrontation with hundreds of A-10s would be disastrous. Pressure builds and global stakes. The operation's ripple effects continued. Venezuela's military credibility was exposed. Russian influence in the region was challenged. U.S. allies got reassurance that America could protect them. Most importantly, the skies over the Caribbean had been claimed, at least temporarily, by the United States. Internationally, the ripple effects continued. Russian and Iranian advisors worked with Venezuelan forces to strengthen air defenses, improve electronic warfare, and train pilots. Strategic bombers conducted flights near Venezuela, and drones were deployed along the coast. Each move was both symbolic and real, a warning that the U.S. could not be ignored. U.S. analysts followed every detail closely. They confirmed that the A-10 flights had achieved their goal. They tested limits, gauged reactions, and proved that the U.S. could dominate the Caribbean skies without engaging in war. Venezuela was shaken, Russia reminded, and the world witnessed the raw power of American air capability. Inside Venezuela, Maduro's government faced growing pressure. Generals urged caution, knowing any direct action could lead to catastrophe. Hardliners wanted to act to show strength. The public display projected confidence, but the fear behind the scenes was clear. Every aircraft and every radar blip reminded leaders that they were outmatched. Across Latin America, reactions remained mixed. Colombia quietly approved of the U.S. show of strength. Brazil stayed neutral. Cuba and Nicaragua continued to condemn the flights. Caribbean nations asked for clarifications after sonic booms shook their towns. But everyone agreed. 200 A-10s had shifted power in the region. Defense experts continued to study the operation. The scale and coordination were unprecedented. Some called it a perfect deterrent. Others warned it was dangerous. One mistake could spark a crisis. The controlled thunder operation kept planes in rotation, maintaining readiness and sending a strong message. The skies belonged to the United States. The consequences were clear. Venezuela's credibility was weakened. Russian influence was challenged. U.S. allies were reassured. And the Caribbean had become a new strategic focus. Every actor in the region knew what was at stake. Beyond just the military effects, the operation created a psychological tension that would last for months. Civilians in Venezuela and nearby countries could hear the roar of engines in the distance, even when the planes were miles away. Reports of sonic booms created a sense of unease. Media outlets replayed footage of formation flights, fueling the perception of an unstoppable force. The message had sunk in. The United States could project power anywhere at any time. The final lesson was unmistakable. The A-10 operation had done more than fly planes. It had tested limits, measured reactions, and drawn a clear line in the sky. Venezuela had been warned. Russia had been reminded. Allies had been reassured. and the world had seen the power of 200 Warthogs. Air dominance meant control, and in the Caribbean, America had just proven it. Even after the planes returned to their bases, tension remained. Every radar operator, every military planner, every official understood the truth. The skies were under U.S. control. The psychological impact lasted long after the roar of engines faded. When Washington analyzed the operation, they agreed on one thing: it had achieved everything it was meant to. It tested reactions, measured nerves, and reinforced U.S. dominance. Controlled thunder kept the presence constant, sending the right message without escalating to war. The A-10s had done more than fly. They had sent a warning that the U.S. could project power, dominate the skies, and control outcomes at any moment. And that message was clear to everyone watching. In the Caribbean, silence is not an option. And there you have it, the full story of 200 A-10 Warthogs roaring across the Caribbean, shaking Venezuela, sending a message to the world, and proving the sheer power of American air dominance. The skies may have gone quiet, but the tension, the strategy, and the warning linger long after the engines fell silent. What do you think? Was this a master stroke of power or a dangerous game with the world on edge? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I want to hear what you think would happen next if tensions escalated further. If you found this story intense, shocking, and mind-blowing, don't forget to hit that like button, share it with friends, and subscribe so you don't miss the next deep dive into military power, strategy, and global standoffs. Trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next in the skies.